In his first 4 months since becoming Labour leader, Keir Starmer has sacked Rebecca Long-Bailey from his shadow cabinet, apologised to ex-staffers who labelled Corbyn's Labour racist, and in the middle of an economic crisis, said very little about his vision for a progressive economy. This has all left many of Labour's left wing in despair. But one prominent Corbynite is still batting for Sir Keir, Paul Mason. Welcome to the show.
How are you doing?
I'm very well. Enjoyed your long read on the weekend, which will form part of the basis of our discussion today. You can catch that on Medium. I'm also joined by Dalia Gebrial. How are you doing, Dalia?
I'm doing all right. Just went for a walk, which was quite nice. But yeah, doing good.
Very nice. We'll be talking about potential coronavirus second wave across Europe in the second half of the show. And finally, we're going to speak to Newsweek's Basit Mahmood about his report on the lack of Black and Muslim commissioners on the UK body charged with enforcing racial equality legislation, the EHRC, a criminally underreported story. I mean, you could call it a scandal. We'll ask him if it qualifies quite as that. As ever, tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour and share the show link. First story. When Keir Starmer stood to be Labour leader, he pitched himself as the unity candidate, able to appeal to and willing to listen to figures from the party's left and right. That meant endorsements from high-profile figures associated with Jeremy Corbyn were particularly valuable to Team Starmer in the middle of that leadership race when he was facing up against Rebecca Long-Bailey. However, as Labour leader, Starmer is expending far more energy distancing himself from the left. High-profile left-wingers have been forced to resign. Legal cases inherited from Corbyn's era conceded, and Starmer proudly declared at PMQs last week that Labour is now under new management. So, Paul, my first question to you. You backed Starmer in the leadership election as the best candidate to further the class struggle. Do you think you were duped?
I certainly don't think I was duped. And let's be clear about what's going on at the moment. Some of the things that you're citing are not things that are being driven by Keir Starmer. If you think about the various legal actions that are going on, and remember how careful one has to be when one is defending like multi-100,000 pound legal actions, all the John Ware stuff, etc. The course for Corbyn to be expelled. These are not things that Starmer is doing, but he's having to deal with them. And I think so. The first thing is to say is that we have to sort of make a list of things that Starmer's done and not done, and other things that he's dealing with that he can't avoid dealing with. And the EHRC report, which will come out soon, is the next phase of that. I think I've written this thing on Medium. They're quite a long 33-minute read. I mean, Medium tells you how much tedium you're inflicting. 33 minutes if you want to get through it. I've written it because I wanted to try and look forward, not because I wanted to look back at why didn't I support Rebecca, why did I support Keir. But I can tell you the reason I supported Keir is because I didn't think the left would break from the idea of trying Corbynism again for another 4 years, unless there was a different leader, unless the coalition of forces were. And what I hoped and what had started to happen was that, if you think about it, Angela Rayner, Annalisa Dodds, Rebecca Long-Bailey herself, various junior frontbenchers from the Socialist Campaign Group had all gone in to Keir's administration. And I thought that was the result that I wanted. I wanted the left, the constructive radical left, to be part of Keir's thing. And I did want what Jeremy Gilbert calls the orthodox left, the kind of unite leadership, squawk box, etc., to try and be constructive. No, the Rebecca's sacking, which, like, for the record, I opposed. I said and told people close to Starmer that it was a mistake. It has put that back. You can't. There's no way around that. It's put that back. But I think my fundamental point is, to the left, Starmer won, and he won with the votes of about half the left. I think if you look at the deputy leadership election, that kind of signals about who voted what. And his project is actually fairly clear, and it is that we can't win by just issuing the 2019 manifesto in 2024 and hoping that people have changed their minds. We have to build a bigger coalition as a party. So that means with Green voters, Liberal Democrat voters, about 1 million Tory voters. And the way to do that is to do what he's doing. Because the only other way to do it is what Clive Lewis advocated, and I'm not unsympathetic to, which is a formal electoral pact with all the other progressive parties. If you don't want to do that, you've got to do something that broadens Labour's appeal, and so that's why I backed him.
I want to go straight to a section from your piece, and which I think kind of summarises the argument you're making. Let's get up a bit of this. So, I'm part of a left that wants to engage with Starmer's project and to help shape it, defending its core agenda of climate, social and economic justice from the inevitable pushback from the party's right. And then slightly later in the essay, you say, if you want a government that smashes the state, that pulls Britain out of NATO and the IMF, defunds the police, forces or adopts a policy of open borders, you are welcome to argue for all these things. But there will be no majority for them inside the Labour Party. And because of the dynamics outlined below, no possibility of Labour coming to power in 2024 if they were adopted. So let's be under no illusions. We got one more. A left government would not constitute socialism. The power of big finance, fossil fuel producers, property speculators and tech monopolies would be constrained. Wealth would be redistributed. The 40-year preference for marketising all parts of social life would be reversed. Power would be redistributed downwards, but the private sector would still constitute over 50% of the economy. And I suppose, I mean, in a way, there's nothing in there is particularly controversial. Well, it will be to some sections of the left, but I don't think to the majority of Labour's members. But what one might ask is how, from looking at the last 4 months of Starmerism, of his actual leadership of the Labour Party, would one be able to be confident that the core tenets of Starmer's project are defending an agenda of climate, social and economic justice, and that he's got actually any interest at all in restraining the power of big finance and fossil fuel producers? Because what it looks like to me at this point in time, and I think probably in terms of strategic questions on this issue, we probably have a lot of agreement. But in terms of the analysis of what Starmer stands for right now, this seems a little bit optimistic and almost a bit like projection.
Okay, so I didn't work on Starmer's campaign in the sense of I didn't go in the office and make phone calls, but I did do some thinking with a small group of people around what the basis of it should be, and I could tell you that one of the problems about the COVID virus is it's got in the way of people being able to interface with the people who are actually now running the party. Even themselves, they don't interface. But at the time, it was very clear to me that these three things, social, climate, and economic justice, are what Starmer believes. Now, to an old, I am a Marxist. I understand that social justice is a kind of liberal concept. I just also think, it happens to be the thing that Clement Attlee promised to implement in 1945. The social justice can be a weapon for the left, and it's why Glenn Beck and all the kind of right in America spend a lot of their time trying to convince people that social justice equals communism. But Keir is a socialist who believes in social, climate, and economic justice. I can tell you that from experience. It's very deeply felt. He's not the same kind of socialist as Jeremy Corbyn or McDonnell or me in that sense. So what makes me think that he will deliver something is that the left has a chance of making it happen. But let's be under no illusion about what we're up against. In the piece, what I'm trying to describe is the anatomy of Labour. I think we've got a legitimate right-wing Labourism. It's always there, and its legitimacy comes from that's what right-wing thinking workers think. Build up the police, death penalty, and the rest of it. But the soft left, throughout its entire history, Trotsky wrote a great article about the soft left in 1920 saying they've got no ideas. And in a way, that's still true. They've got some sort of little sort of tweaky ideas. Watch the Resolution Foundation for the sort of tweaks to capitalism. But generally, they tend to adopt what the left fights for in a watered down form. And what I wanted to try and convince the left to do was to engage with this project. Because if we don't, there's absolutely one surefire outcome. The Labour right will define it. They are there. They are in there. You saw some of the briefings against Ed Miliband. He's now a leftist. Some people in the shadow cabinet, some people, we don't know who, have briefed the Times that Ed Miliband was too radical. So that's what we're up against. If we don't engage with it, I mean, the first thing is if we walk away, and I know lots of people who came into politics under Jeremy only have experienced a party where it feels good to be a member. I've experienced a party where for most of the time in it, it feels so bad to be a member, you don't want to be in it. But it's still the only vehicle we have for creating a left government. So I wanted to convince people to engage with what Keir is trying to do. And what he is trying to do is to, I mean, look, it's not, he's trying to write a manifesto right now. And that is frustrating for those of us who've always operated in that way. I want to see a big vision. What he's trying to do is to reconstruct the alliance. What I understand the Shadow Cabinet is discussing at every meeting it has is, what does it feel like in Basit Law? What does it feel like in Lee? What does it feel like in North Tyneside? That's what they're spending their time doing. And it will come as no surprise to Novara's viewers and listeners that, you know, for example, BLM hasn't gone down massively, superbly well in those places. That there is a lot of support for the way the Tories have handled the virus, whereas in London, in Vauxhall, where I live, there is absolute outrage at the way. So we're still having to deal with this culture war problem, which is the number one problem we're dealing with, as well as Scotland. And I think Keir Starmer has a way to do that, but the left will only be ascendant in that. It will only be listened to if it engages with it. If we walk away, fine, set up a new party. It's been done before, it won't work. Podemos, who brilliantly set up a party, got 15-20% of the vote at one point. They're in government with Social Democrats. The pesky Social Democrats have a way of, getting in the way of the kind of dream of a pure road to a left government. So we've got to try and work with them to create the agenda for a left government in 2024. Now, what I said in that, you flashed up another quote, and I'm just trying to be realistic. What I'm saying is open borders and defund the police are legitimate positions inside the Labour movement, and I totally understand people who have them, but we're not going to achieve them inside this Labour Party in 2024. I think what we can achieve is a commitment to zero net carbon. And I think that one of my critiques of what we did in 2019 is we never spelled out what the priorities were. In the manifesto, there'd be half a page on some minor reform to local government and like 3 lines about decarbonising the world. We never embodied a kind of set of, we'll do this and we'll do this other thing if we can, that kind of methodology. And I think we've got to try and learn to do that. So, yeah, I mean, I think I want to see a vibrant ultra left in Labour. I won't be part of it. But I mean, in that sense, on the open borders question, on the defund the police question, on the smashing state question, but I want to see that current in Labour. But I think that that's why I've kind of banged on a bit in this piece about the Comintern, the Workers' Government, 4th Congress, 1922. Communist Party said, look, in a period of retreat, we've got to form governments with Social Democrats. They did it in Saxony and Thuringia in Germany, and because that's the only thing we can do.
I suppose there's another way of putting this, because I think in terms of strategy, as I say, on this particular question, we're going to talk about China in a moment, where I think we probably have some more fundamental disagreement. But on the question of how the left should engage with the Labour Party, I think basically we agree, because, well, from my perspective, whether or not Keir Starmer is secretly left-wing and he just hasn't let us know it yet, the most useful thing for the left to do is to have a vibrant left within the party that is both popular among the wider membership and popular among the public. Because if, as you believe, Keir Starmer wants to move left, that creates the space for him to do it. Or if, as many people have come to conclude, he doesn't particularly want to move left, he was kind of overemphasizing those parts of his value system in the leadership election, then that's the only way you're going to push him in that direction. And nothing is lost by creating an independent, vibrant left in the Labour Party that talks about issues people care about. But for you, at what point? So I suppose you're saying you've spoken to Keir Starmer, you know him personally, but for people who don't, and myself included as well here, if we've watched for 4 months that there have been all of these opportunities to come forward, and I'm not expecting him to defund the police, hell no, but I think you could be at this point in time making a massive move to say, look, the government is trying to rush everyone back into their workplaces, rush them back onto the tube at rush hour, just to save low skilled, low paid jobs in pret a manger, and it's going to risk all of our health. You don't want to do it anyway. It feels like at the moment there is a massive opportunity where if you were interested in even moderate social democratic reform, popular moderate social democratic reform, you'd be talking about it. And we still see week after week Labour front benchers who go on television and say, oh, well, it's not our job to come up with alternatives to the government. And I think, how long does this continue before you say maybe you got him wrong?
Well, it's like Muhammad Ali had to stand on the ropes for 14 rounds before he floored Joe Frazier. You know, it's a frustrating process, and I'm frustrated by it, and I don't necessarily think it's the best idea. But it is. You've got to distinguish between tactics and strategy. The tactic is that, you know, in Sedgefield and the places we've lost, they support Boris Johnson. The reason Boris is on 40% isn't because Keir's, you know, not left wing enough. It's because a lot of people like authoritarian conservative nationalism with an overt racist agenda. No, we can't. We've got to find something that moves them away from that. But I think that yes, the critique, the idea of standing there forever and saying, well, we're criticizing the government because it's not doing well enough. I would prefer a big vision. I would prefer there to be some values stated. I would prefer that. See, one of the problems we had, I went on the second of the BLM demos that I could have gone on, because at the first everybody was still locked down and I didn't know whether it was a good idea. When I went on it in Vauxhall, where I live, it wasn't only a huge 30,000 strong black and white demo. As a black experience, because I've lived in that area for 32 years, it was the biggest black demonstration South London's ever seen outside the American Embassy. There wasn't a single Labour MP or councillor on it. There wasn't a Labour presence. There wasn't a Labour banner, and we have missed out as a party on a huge radicalisation process. We need to catch up, and I think that if we did catch up, well, the next time it happens, the next thing that happens, we've got to be out there. And I think Momentum, which I'm a member of and I support, and the Left Slate, which I support, have got to start thinking now. Let's get out into society, because the only way we're going to set the agenda isn't by sort of sitting there saying, Keir, you know, be bolder. We need to be bolder. We need to create facts through activity and activism and challenge Labour to support that. So that's what I'll be trying to do in the next few months. By the way, I think it's fairly clear that the agenda, actually, the way to save the British economy is to stop a second wave of the coronavirus. But as the Tories withdraw their furlough scheme too soon, and you know, in a crude way, starting, you know, actually quite soon, it starts at the beginning of August, doesn't it? I think it's fairly clear that that is an opportunity for Labour to say, you know, we're the party of jobs, we're the party of a non-coercive benefit system. I think many of the kind of centrist frontbenchers will be saying we're the party of jobs. Let's make sure that they also say that universal credit is a disgrace, and that we, where workers and benefit claimants, because there'll be tens of thousands of new benefits claimants who've never experienced this Gestapo-like experience before, who will now experience it. When I was 22, what we did is we formed unemployed centres, we formed unemployed unions, we had a people's march, you know, kind of Jarrow March style thing. Let's do that. There's huge opportunities for us. And if the centrists don't want to do it, let's do it anyway. You can't stop us. So that's my kind of general modus operandi with what's going on in Labour. But the main point reiterated is, I want the left to start specifying what effects it wants to achieve, rather than a list of policies it's kind of attached to. I think it is clear now that because we have to win in 2024, and it'll be a massive swing that we need to do it, that the only way we're going to achieve that is if we start convincing people through a combination of action and argument, and that means convincing them about that they, you know, I would say we're going to have a kind of filter in our heads. Is this policy coming from the masses? Is it popular? Does it change people's lives? Does it enhance social climate and economic justice? Will it piss other people off? Will it unnecessarily alienate people who we need to vote for us? I think in a way, this is a maturation process for the movement of people who came into politics around Corbyn. And it could have been done under Rebecca. It could have been done under Lisa Nandy, to be honest, because it's the question. It is the most sensible and important question. How do we create a narrative that convinces people? We clearly failed in 2019, and everybody's got to take responsibility for it, me included. But to learn lessons going forward, that's what we need to do.
We're getting some interesting super chats through. I am going to read those out while we've still got Paul on with questions and comments. So keep those coming. But before we do that, I want us to move on to a slightly different topic, which is the one where I think we do have sort of, in a way, all of this conversation about Keir Starmer is speculative, because whether or not he's secretly left wing, as I say, to me, it doesn't seem like our actions change that much. But this is a concrete policy area where, you know, there are real disagreements about what Labour should be doing, how they should be intervening, what effects they should be seeking. So I'm going to get up a couple of tweets from last week. So you did a tweet, Fred, you know, when tensions between China and America were heightening. And the two bits that stood out to me, or the bits that I thought, not sure about those, and that I'd like to, you know, further question you on, was Pompeo is right about one thing. The real Chinese people love freedom. Given 1 ounce of it, they would mobilize in the workplace around real trade unions and secure the same rights as Western workers. So she is ultimately the policeman on behalf of Apple, General Electric, etc. And then let's go to the next one as well. So it's number 7 that I thought, you know, also stood out. Meanwhile, the left has to get serious. I predicted in Clear Bright Future that she would start to export his Marxism to the West. That's happening now. Western Marxism, with its commitment to humanism, workerism, and democracy, is under attack. And there are two sort of ideas there that you know, set off alarm bells with me. And one of them is, what's the evidence of that? So you're sort of, to me, it looks a bit like you're imposing on the Chinese population. They want exactly the same liberal rights as we've got in the West, whereas it's quite possible that the Chinese population have recognized that, you know, what their government has achieved is actually pretty phenomenal when it comes to comparisons with other countries in the global South. And the idea that you can just have a liberal social democracy and develop in the way China has, I mean, historically, it isn't really borne out. So where people have tried to do that in a democratic way, coups happen. And then, so it seems a bit like you're potentially imposing something which, quite rightly or quite reasonably, it seems that the Chinese aren't necessarily asking for, if you look at polls and you look at surveys, etc. And then the second one, which is potentially even more, I suppose, worrying, is this idea that Xi is trying to export his model of Marxism, because obviously at the height of the Cold War, that was the big myth, that the Soviet Union, what they wanted to do was export communism to the United States and to the West. And that was the misunderstanding of what they were trying to do. And it also led to, you know, some real hawkish, terrible foreign policy.
Yeah, well, let's deal with these things one at a time. I mean, I've reported 6 times from China. I think I'm the only English journalist who stood in the Great Hall of the People and sang the Internationale during a Communist Party Congress. The person next to me, my minder from the Global Times, was outraged. He said, "What, you're a Marxist?" I said, "Yeah, I know the words." And so, you know, I spent a lot of the time while I was allowed to report in China, and there were freer times and less free times, trying to speak to the independent workers movement in China. In 2018, I went to Hong Kong, and there was a cross-border NGO private conference, we didn't advertise it, where the workers' leaders from the Guangdong province factories in unofficial unions came, the lawyers, the migrant leaders. They're under a severe repression. And so I speak from experience. I've met them. And, you know, I can tell you that the moment that either they were allowed to form free trade unions, or the Chinese state trade union started acting like a union, they would join en masse and go on strike. You know that there's been strikes all over China in the electronics and auto industries, and they're always suppressed by what is a ruthless dictatorship. So the point was, I mean, that tweet wasn't saying Pompeo is right. It was saying, it's saying, the point is, when Mike Pompeo has made this big speech against China, big xenophobic anti-Chinese movement coming from Washington, the point is, unlike the Cold War, what's the difference? America had no factories in Russia during the Cold War. Today, the role of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party is to be the policeman for American corporate power. That's what, and German and Japanese and South Korean. So I think I'm not trying to impose on something, and I think, Michael, I'd warn against the kind of, the Chinese people are different. They want authoritarianism. That has been a big argument, actually, of Confucianism. It's been a big argument of the Qing dynasty as it was falling. And what did the first communists say? Chen Duxiu, the founder of Chinese communists, said Western thought is better. That's what he said. In fact, going to the second point, you could argue that Chen Duxiu was one of the first quote unquote Western Marxists. Now, the second point I make is very similar. I mean, in my book, there's an entire chapter that says and proves that it's not the communist system. Of course, they're not trying to export this kind of state capitalist system to the West. What they are trying to do is to argue that communism has to be, and Marxism has to be anti-humanist. That is, it must be, most of the humanist stuff is suppressed. And one of that there are 7 don't speaks in China, decreed by Xi, things that cannot be said on a university campus. And number 7 is you cannot criticize the government of China using Marxist language. So, I mean, in other words, now I get regular emails from ex-comrades. I've had like abusive emails from a kind of famous ex-Trotskyist economist who lives in Beijing. There is a pro Xi Jinping, anti-humanist, dictatorial, I'll use the S word, Stalinist form of Marxism. And the point of having to share the labor movement with those people is that you're allowed to criticize them, surely.
Oh, I think criticism's welcome. I just think on this one, you're probably wrong. I want to get up a quote from a political scientist, Bruce Dixon, professor of political science at Columbian College of Arts and Science. This was from, the Washington Post, actually, not the Morning Star. So he did lots of surveys about the Chinese population, and he says, in general, people have complaints, they want some changes, but ultimately, they think the system works. And I would say that, in general, they're quite possibly rational too. And that's not from a morally relativistic position. That's just that countries are in different situations. They're under different threats from imperialism, fundamentally. Let's get it up anyway. In casual conversations in China, people will complain extensively about pollution, about traffic congestion, about the cost of healthcare, about corruption, about a whole bunch of things that they find irritating. Many of those are things Americans also complain about. But then if you ask them if they want a different form of government to deal with those problems, they say, of course not. They just want the current system to work better. The findings from my surveys are different from the messages that we often get in the media, but they are consistent with every academic study I've seen that has looked at regime support in the country. And I think it's especially that last bit that's quite important. He's saying every academic study he's looked at, which is very different to being a journalist and speaking, to leading activists or leading journalists. If you've got a population who recognize that you've got neighboring countries who've taken the advice of the West, they've introduced liberal reforms, and then what happens if they try and do moderate social democracy, they get overthrown. We've just seen it happen in Bolivia. Vincent Bevins, who did a great interview with Aaron recently, he wrote a whole book on the fact that everywhere liberal humanist social democracy has been tried, you get a CIA coup. So it seems, I suppose, for me, if you've got a government who has managed to bring 850 million people out of poverty, which is unusual when you've got, the imperial American state, very wanton to intervene in these kind of situations, then a bit of humility is potentially in order. And that obviously doesn't mean we can't be critical of things like the treatment of the Uyghurs, for example. But the idea that the Chinese, like Westerners, deserve liberal democracy, et cetera, so they should have it, that's potentially not an option. And potentially they know it's not an option, which is why they're backing the Communist Party, which has brought about a kind of development in China, which very few other countries in the global south have managed.
I'm sorry, I think this is deluded. You do know that the workers in Fukushima, in Foxconn, had to sign contracts promising not to commit suicide. So and that there are strikes of tens of thousands. Do these people sound to you as if they love the system? No, they certainly don't want imperialism. I mean, because they understand. And we should always acknowledge that our country and our culture imperialized China. They understand that their entire country was ripped off and destroyed by British, French, and American imperialism in the 19th century. Absolutely. And I would also say that I'm certainly not arguing that they should adopt, constitutional liberal democracy. What I'm arguing is actually something much more subtle about human rights and workers' rights. So when I first started reporting from China, first trip I went to was Shenzhen, the heartland of industrial capitalism in China, and the local government was experimenting with all kinds of local democracy, peasant democracy. They'd legalized some proto trade unions. The problem I have is all that's been demolished by Xi Jinping, and the left supporters of Xi argue that the democratization stuff was bad, that it was pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist. So there's an argument going on there. I think the people, Bolivia, absolutely. Bolivia, there's been the military coup. Elon Musk's boasting about it, apparently. But let's remember some other countries, and these are very salient in China, especially in southern China, where people are very close to them, and northern China. Let's go through them. South Korea, Taiwan. South Korea and Taiwan are democracies. They're flawed democracies, but they're democracies. When I went to South Korea, every public square has a tent in it with a trade union occupation going on in it. And what Chinese Democrats will say, not all of whom are reactionary, is that the real comparison between what the CCP achieved should be with Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea. Now, I don't necessarily buy that argument, but it just shows you that the one-sided, this heroic, clawing our way out of poverty, which we must acknowledge, absolutely. The 1949 revolution was a revolution. But the thing to do is engage, because there are, I think inside the CCP, there are study groups of Trotsky, there are study groups of Gramsci, there's all kinds of argument going on. All of it's been pressed down under Xi Jinping to engage those people back into an argument about what is Marxism, was what all I'm trying to do. So let's be clear, I'm not saying they're exporting state capitalism. It's anti-humanist Marxism that is my big enemy in this polemic.
But then it feeds into foreign policy. So you basically want a more hawkish line when it comes to China, no?
Well, but I certainly don't want the hawkish line that the conservative research group's been pushing, which is all about Tom Cotton, this American senator, the Wuhan flu. No, absolutely not. What I do think is that Labour's foreign policy, actually, even under Corbyn, has been remarkably consistent. Tony Blair made his speech 1999. We rely on the international community for our security. Emily Thornberry didn't stray very far from that, nor did David Miliband. That's Labour's foreign policy. The problem is the international community is falling apart, and the Americans are ripping it apart, and China is playing its part. It's not kind of just a passive, defenseless kind of being. It's militarizing the South China Sea. Britain's a minor power. What it can do is pretty minimal. What it can speak up for the Uyghurs, number one. It can speak up for the Hong Kong Democrats. If those Hong Kong citizens do come to our country, which we should welcome them, we should speed their ability to become British citizens. It will double the size of the left in Britain overnight, I can tell you, because Hong Kong is a left-wing city. And on containing China, we should have nothing to do with what Trump is doing. We can't anyway. We've got 19 ships in our navy. I think China's got 19 ships, in a small portion of the South China Sea. What we can say is there are, as a Labour movement, and if we get into as a Labour government, we do actually want to maintain the international rule of law and multilateralism. And we want to try and bring Xi Jinping, or whoever's ruling China at that time, likely to be Xi Jinping, to a negotiating table from a position of honesty, which is to say, and I would include Gordon Brown with this. I was in China with Gordon in, I think it was 2009, when he was on a trip there. And, he didn't raise the human rights. Tony Blair never raised human rights. Cameron didn't. Neither was Boris Johnson. They're all hypocrites. And I think we should start from a position of defending human rights everywhere on earth.
I'm going to bring in some audience questions. We've got Nishat1976 with a £48.99 super chat. Very kind. The party is focusing on the red wall by throwing its black and POC voters under the bus. And they're also upset about you for writing at The Spectator. Stal Staniforth with a £10 super chat. Points out that you said in The Spectator on the 4th of July, RLB has to go, but it looks like bad party management, which I suppose is slightly at odds with what you were saying in terms of he shouldn't have done that. And AK De Scholar with a tenner says, if Starmer decides how he treats BLM and racial issues based on red wall voters rather than what the morally correct and BAME communities want, he will lose a lot of traditional black voters. So I'll give you a sort of quick fire answer to all of those, and then we should probably.
I think that's true. I think that's true. If he did that, he would, and that is one of my big fears. There is an unresolved argument going on inside the Labour left about how we deal with the culture war. We haven't got time to deal with it here, but I am on the side, and as you know, Michael, I've always on the side. Our core is the progressive, culturally liberal population, which includes the BAME community. We cannot. I am not prepared to make that bargain, even if it were a bargain that meant you had to do it to take power. What was the stuff on China? What was the stuff I'm supposed to have done? Look, I wrote a diary.
No, that was a specky. That was writing for the specky, not the China. Yeah. That was not about China.
So writing for the specky. I'm a freelance journalist. I as a Gramscian Marxist, I try to build hegemony. What does that mean? It means trying to convince people on the other side that you're a human being worth listening to. The diary is meant to be a semi-funny thing. So there's no contradiction, by the way, between saying it was a mistake to sack Rebecca and what it says in the article. If you read the full article, is that it goes through the moment by moment. There was a moment where lots of people in the Socialist Campaign Group were being called on to quit Starmer's cabinet, Starmer's front bench. There was a moment where people were saying, that's it now, we're going to go to war over Becky. But as I understand it, Rebecca Long-Bailey was messaging other MPs saying, don't do that. Just tweet support and then let's move on. So as a fact, it's true. She had to go because she wouldn't obey an order. And it was a mistake for Starmer to get himself into that position. But having done that, there was no hill to die on for people. If there would have been, and if there is in future, I would certainly go for it. I think that it's a blow to the left that she's gone, because it comes into the context. Let's finish by throwing it forward. The context is that we have got outside the party and on the right of the party people who want to blow apart the compromise I am trying to create between
I'm just going to bring in Dalia, left, because Dalia's been waiting very patiently.
I'm sorry, stop talking. Yeah, fire away.
Yeah, I mean, wow, there's like a lot there. I really want to because I disagree with basically almost everything that you were saying. I think the one thing that I probably have some commonality is this idea of we overestimated what could be achieved within a Labour government, even if it was under Corbynism. I think this idea that we could be mitigating capital, but still the private sector would have a lot of power is probably true. But this whole policy of triangulation, of concession, of focusing all of our energy on trying to win over the people that have defined politics for the last few decades. So that is your sort of your regular voters and your lobby journalists. That is exactly the mistake that we made in 2019, as opposed to how we operated in 2017, where the Labour government, where the Labour Party, the Labour leadership was much more able to understand that it will never gain its power from as an insurrectionary campaign. It will never gain its power from appeasement of those forces. It can only gain its power through mobilization and galvanization of people who have been dispossessed and marginalized from politics for a very long time. And I think it's really interesting that the very issue that we were told that we must concede on, which is the issue of policing, the very issue that between, in the last 2 years of Corbynism, we became reactionary, we became very much involved in these kind of like ridiculous talking points around austerity being a problem because it meant that the police weren't adequately funded. The very issue of policing that we conceded on was the very issue that a few months after a colossal defeat as a result was the very issue that one of the most multiracial, working class, geographically dispersed. This was not just happening in big multiracial cities. It was happening in towns, etc. That was the very issue that we had this giant mobilization around, which tells you that the source of power, which tells you that we got something really, really wrong. And by we, I mean sort of like as a broad left, not, I'm not really part of the Labour Party. So I'm not really aware, I'm not really clued into the kind of internal Labour Party machinations. But like the whole point is that when we galvanized our power from the street and from those dispossessed communities, we did much better. Whereas when you look at the concession around issues like militarism, like policing, like immigration enforcement, which, by the way, these are not culture war issues. These are class war issues. Immigration, policy, policing policy, mass incarceration, these are ways of forming dispossessed working class people and in a racialized way. So these are class war issues. The concession of all of these issues broke apart the social coalition that nearly got Corbynism in government in 2017. And when it comes as well to the China stuff, I think it's a really sort of, again, I completely disagree with it. I think this idea of a Western Marxism versus firstly, I don't know who Xi Jinping is exporting his alleged Marxism to. I think we all know that China is a state-controlled capitalist state that largely does the disciplinary, dirty work of American capital. So when you talk about those Foxconn workers, is that a problem of anti-humanist Chinese Marxism? Or is it a problem of American capital, which uses the muscle of authoritarian regimes that it often props up in global South countries in order to discipline their workforce, in order to feed in and be the producing workers for American and European capital? And also, when you talk about this idea of Western Marxism being unique, being the humanist or democratic Marxism, I just want to remind you that some of the most incredible intellectual and strategic iterations of Marxism that we've seen historically were in the anti-colonial struggles in the global South, at a time when Britain and the West was colonizing the world, was burning archives, putting people in labor camps. It was the Marxist anti-colonial movements that taught the world what it really means to be humanist. So this very Orientalist way of dividing the world into Westerners who value democracy and value humanism versus the Orient, who can never understand democracy or do not contribute to the intellectual traditions of democracy and justice, is a very bizarre enforced binary that really does not reflect the fact that historically, interventions in terms of movements and justice-oriented movements have typically come from the grassroots, the working classes from across the world. And it's the states of those different nation states that have tended to be the more the agents, the social agents that have suppressed that.
So Frantz Fanon was a Western Marxist. Chen Duxiu was a Western Marxist. Nelson Mandela was a Western Marxist. They were all West. I mean, you have to look it up on Wikipedia. No, that Western Marxism is a category. It's not something I've made up. It's a historic category of thought.
And also,
because it called itself Western Marxism. The
core of Fanonian thought is, yes, it's about a reclamation of humanism, but it's about how the ideas of humanism were never present in European history.
I know.
So
because he called.
He's a black Marxist because he brings together the black radical tradition and is which is also constructed around Marxist principles. So why not call it the black Marxist tradition? Because that's actually
I do
the most
CLR
humanist
James,
tradition.
Yeah, CLR James is another one. Yeah, CLR James is another one, as you know, wrote The Black Jacobins, profound critic of orthodox Marxism, wrote in what we call Herbert Marcuse, Antonio Gramsci, Gog Lukács. They call themselves, their followers described it as Western Marxism. And it disappoints me that some of the people who are attacking me actually don't know this fact. If you're going to talk eloquently and with authority about politics, you can do it from experience, But if you're going to say, I don't know what Western Marxism is, as one of my critics say, well, go and look it up. I didn't invent it. Okay, so as to regard to your idea that I am orientalizing, I'm doing the opposite. I'm saying, as Michael just pointed out, I'm saying Chinese workers have just the same right to democracy and freedom as we do, and that they want it just as much. That's the internationalist position. It is, in fact, the orientalizing position that says they can't think for themselves. They don't want democracy. They want order. They have no concept of the self. These are the racist constructs that Chinese workers have been fighting against for 100 years. And they do it through what? The weapon of Marxism. And that's why I care so much about Xi Jinping trying to say that the Chinese system is Marxist. It isn't, as you point out. It is a front for Western capitalism. So we should have no hesitation, I think, in criticizing what we don't agree with. Sure.
The problem with this framing of it as Western Marxism is bizarre to me, because that is not, from what I have seen, that is not how, as someone who is, studying Fanon and studying C.L.R. James as part of my PhD, like, that is not something. They are much more rooted in what they describe as the Black radical tradition, which is a counterpoint to a lot of Western sort of conceptions of progression and liberal democracy, which have conditionalities around what it means to be human in order to access human rights. So the Western approach of human rights did not include for the fact that the same Western doctrine that would give rise to that also created boundaries around the human being. So the Black radical Marxist tradition comes in and asks for and intervenes on the basis that actually we need to come up with an expansive and unconditional idea of the human that takes into account how racialization, how bordering has taken that away from significant portions of the world. So I completely agree that this idea of, looking at at Chinese workers and saying that they don't have a right to those equal workers' rights. Of course, that's of course the case. But what I would argue is this is not a struggle between East and West. It is a struggle, or Chinese and West. It is a struggle between workers across the world and their nations, the leaders of their nation states, whose job it is to enforce the boundaries of capital.
I'm going to have to put an end to the debate there. I'm sorry. I think this could go in very interesting directions, but we've got another guest waiting. Paul,
do another one. Okay.
We agree on some things, we disagree on some things, but it's always incredibly stimulating to have you on the show. People are saying that in the comments. So yeah, thank you for coming on, even to have some disagreements. We'll speak soon. Rob's 2020, great show. Paul Mason is always a stimulating guest with €10. I agree. And Gavin Ferguson with £100 super chat. Thank you very much, Gavin. We're going to go straight to it. It was going to be our third story, but it's now going to be our second story because we're running over a little bit. Before we go to that, though, do share the show link. Give this video a like. We've got lots of people viewing tonight. We want to get those likes up. It helps on that algorithm. Tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission, or EHRC, has responsibility for the promotion and enforcement of equality and non-discrimination laws in Britain. However, 2 recent reports have questioned whether it's up for the job of creating a fairer Britain. This is because whilst the EHRC is tasked with promoting racial equality, its 10-member board contains only 1 non-white commissioner. Since 2012, there have been no Black or Muslim commissioners overseeing the work of the public body. What's more, reforms made over the last decade have led to accusations that the EHRC is too close to the government, towing its lines instead of challenging them and letting down certain communities in the process. To discuss what's gone wrong at the UK Equalities Commission, I'm delighted to be joined by Basit Mahmood. Basit is a journalist at Newsweek who broke a really brilliant story actually in Newsweek yesterday. I'll go through some of that in a moment. First of all, welcome to the show, Basit.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
And thank you for waiting. I want to get up a few sort of the findings from your report yesterday. And I think it's notable that this was in an American magazine, not in a UK one, because this is not really been reported in this country. So two former commissioners at the UK's Equalities and Human Rights Commission, or the EHRC, the country's equalities watchdog, say they were not reappointed to their roles because they were too loud and vocal about issues of race, Newsweek can reveal. Baroness Miriam Hussein Ehrc, who at the time was the only Muslim commissioner, and Lord Simon Woolley, who was the only black commissioner, both lost their positions in November 2012. The piece goes on. We were too loud for what the new coalition government wanted, Lord Woolley told Newsweek. Our job as commissioners was to do exactly what they were supposed to do, to raise the fundamental issues of tackling race inequality in education, in health, in employment, within the criminal justice system, and I saw that as my central role. But it made me very quickly aware to me that that strong voice was not wanted. They, so the government, did not want the voices that challenge the big structural inequalities, which of course is the raison d'etre of the Commission, and then to work out plans to use its powers to demand change. I mean, many of our viewers will find it kind of phenomenal that we've got, the body which is in charge of enforcing racial discrimination laws itself has no black or Muslim members on a 10-person panel. I think this has been criminally underreported. How did you come across this particular story?
Yeah, so I'd been looking into the EHRC for the last about a year, and I originally received a tip-off that, so I was the one that reported the story about the commissioner donating to the Conservative Party, Panther Cooper. And then the more I kind of looked into it, I thought, well, it's interesting that there's no, why isn't there a more diverse board on the EHRC despite the remit? I mean, a lot of people don't realise that the EHRC has been given a Category A status from the UN. For its kind of work on human rights and challenging discrimination and equality. So I thought it's interesting that there's no black or Muslim commissioners. So I started to look into it, and the last two didn't get reappointed in 2012. So I started to dig around and ask them why. And shockingly, both of them said very similar things, that the reason they weren't reappointed, they felt, and it's crucial to make this distinction, that they felt that for the government, the coalition government at the time, they were too vocal and too loud on issues of racism. And Lord Woolley said something very powerful, that the commission isn't a place for a chit chat, but that he felt that vociferously holding institutions to account for racism, that strong voice wasn't welcome. And when I asked Baroness Miriam, she similarly said that she was told that from the Equalities Office, she alleges that they wanted more people from business-oriented backgrounds, and that race equality slipped down the agenda, and therefore both of them feared that. Well, they said that it cost them their reappointment onto the commission.
I said a couple of reports had sort of brought this to light in my introduction. I want to go to a few quotes from a piece that was in Middle East Eye last week by John Holmwood and Peter Oborn, and get your thoughts on this, because they go into some detail about how I suppose the absence of representation and the closeness to the government has had practical effects on certain communities. So let's go to this. And one of the focuses of this piece, is the legal changes which have weakened the body's independence from government. So it was created in 2007 by Labour. The Tories come in, they passed the Reform of Public Bodies Act in 2011. And as a result of that act, they say the EHRC emerged with a considerably reduced budget and a requirement for onerous bi-monthly meetings with the responsible minister. Its annual budget was slashed by 68% and subject to Cabinet Office spending approval. Commissioners were recruited from those with expertise, e.g. from among former civil servants and business people, rather than experience, e.g. from among civil society groups active on equalities. It also increased the number of commissioners with links to the Tory party, and this may help to explain why the EHRC at present does not have a single black commissioner, nor apparently any from a form of Muslim background. And so, they're talking about exactly the same things that you are. Can you talk about some of the changes, Basit, that have, I suppose, taken place since 2011? Because I think there are lots of things that I was surprised by. The fact that commissioners are basically just appointed by the government minister. So in a way, you've got the government marking its own homework. The people who are supposed to look at whether, especially government institutions, are behaving in a discriminatory fashion, they are appointed by the government ministers they should be investigating. So it seems like it is set up to be a fairly toothless body.
it's not just people on the left or left-wingers saying or accusing the EHRC of bias. Maria Miller, who's a Qualities Minister between November 2012 and 14, said that this goes back before just Conservative government. So in 2007, it started off with a budget of, I haven't read Peter Overton's piece fully, but I know that the budget was cut from £70 million to £17.4 million. It went from being a body that was had staff of around 425, and now it's got about 200. So I started to look at in terms of changes. One of the interesting things that came out from a Conservative MP, in this case Maria Miller, who accused the EHRC of being timid in the use of its enforcement powers, was that they not only didn't really use their enforcement powers, that's what she alleged, that they didn't use the enforcement powers, but that also, they'd taken on the role of 3 former bodies. And she disagrees with the idea that cost it somehow its focus, but Lord Woolley said it did. You had the Commission for Racial Equality, for example, which he felt was very focused when it came to tackling issues of racism. You had a specific disability commissioner on the EHRC. So it's not just about race, it's also about gender and sexuality. And she also accused the EHRC of being very slow. Now, in response, the EHRC said that it's doubled its use of enforcement powers. But I think the important question to ask for me, is from a journalist's point of view, is the EHRC serving the people it's supposed to serve? It was set up to stop discrimination. It was set up to compel public housing bodies or institutions, educational institutions, to comply with the 2006 Equalities Act. And this is the important point. Lord Woolley said that the Equalities and Human Rights Commission is a unique body in the UK, the only body that's capable of holding institutions to account, whether it's political parties or educational institutions or whatever. They've got unique powers into enforcement agreements and all that. And both Maria Miller and Lord Woolley and Baroness Murrell are all saying that the EHRC has not used its enforcement powers, and the barrier that stopped it is the interpretation. This is where it gets very legalistic. The interpretation of the threshold for when it can act and when an unlawful act's being committed. In response, the EHRC says that it's doubled its use of enforcement powers. But
I'm going to bring Dalia in because I know she'll have loads of thoughts about this particular story. Dalia.
Yeah, I really appreciate. I think it's really important for journalists like Basit to really be on the case and documenting and writing and archiving actually how experiments like the EHRC have panned out. I'm going to contribute from a bit more of a kind of overall perspective, which is I think it's interesting how, and Paul Gilroy wrote an essay that in 1990 that will forever be something that I just continue to come back to when trying to understand how race and racism is spoken about and understood in Britain. And that is that the essay is called The End of Anti-Racism. And it basically talks about how anti-racism in the UK was, during the sort of 70s and the 80s, we see this kind of movement-based approach to anti-racism, where we see community organizing, trade union activism, the black sections of the Labour Party, etc. But all of it is very kind of like community-based. We see like literal physical infrastructure in terms of, community centres and music halls, and these all being really central parts of how anti-racism is conceptualized and fought, and how that struggle is fought. And then you have the sort of 1990s and the 2000s where we kind of have this appropriation of this kind of more community-based organizing strategy around anti-racism. And Paul Gilroy talks about how we got turned from activists to community representatives. And it's basically how this kind of top-down state multiculturalism as a replacement for anti-racist organizing is in, you don't need to do any more anti-racist organizing. And in fact, if you do, we're going to kind of call you crazy. We're going to tell you that you should go through proper channels, because we have these different kinds of bodies who have these unelected representatives who, we've divided the multiracial groups in Britain into these sort of like in these divided categories who all fight against each other for minimal state resources. And I think that the EHRC is a really interesting case study in what happens when the state tries to become the main vehicle for anti-racist struggle. And I think that this, and especially when you have it on a representative base, i.e., it's enough to just have one representative from each identity bracket represented in these organizations, and that's sort of the be all and end all of anti-racist organizing. And I think that it's an interesting thing that I think we need to think through, which is that, yes, it is important for us to win spaces within the state in order to kind of hold institutions accountable, and to have that institution accountable to us as well. But I think we also need to understand that this is part of the limits of a state mandated top-down anti-racist approach, and that actually there also needs to be a kind of more one that is based in a lot of different spaces, whether it's in your trade unions or whether it's in, you know, artistic communities, or whether it's in anti-gentrification organizing, that there needs to be that sort of extra parliamentary approach as well. So I think that contradiction there has really come through, in that when you put all your eggs in that kind of basket and you rely on state apparatuses, it's very easy for the state to appropriate those to particular ends, which I think is kind of what we have been seeing in the EHRC.
In a way, I suppose that's a question about, can the EHRC be reformed so that it functions better and potentially represents, you know, all ethnic groups better? I know that obviously in that Peter Oborne piece, what they highlight is the fact that there was sort of a refusal to investigate the Prevent program, which was, you know, could be explained in two different ways, either as, you know, a bit of a disregard for protection of Muslims, or as a reluctance to challenge a government policy, a government program. And I actually want to throw in one completely different question in a way, which is, do you think this closeness to the government and I suppose the absence of Black people and Muslims on the panel is related to the fact that the EHRC decided to investigate the Labour Party about anti-Semitism, but not the Conservative Party about Islamophobia, which many people saw to be, you know, treating the two parties and the two issues unequally? I don't know if you think that's a fair criticism or a fair connection to make.
I mean, moving my personal opinion kind of to one side, I mean, the whole way I tried to go about it was just by looking at the facts, and the facts are that, you know, it's a commission of 10. The Muslim Council of Britain have submitted dossier after dossier to the. I think they submitted about 3 or 4, you know, reports, and they've also written to the HRC. They, you know, you were talking about Uyghurs earlier on. You know, there were Conservative Party members in one of those reports that the Muslim Council of Britain alleges that were talking about sterilising Muslims and throwing them off bridges. And it's interesting that, you know, I think it is quite interesting how Conservative politicians have all of a sudden found a voice to challenge Islamophobia. But when it comes to, you know, the Islamophobia inquiry, which British Muslim communities, and again, I wrote a piece before the Pav to Cooper one about the commissioner who donated, you know, funds to the Conservative Party, which she claimed was to her friend, but the Electoral Commission says it's to the party itself.
And she's by coincidence the only non-white panelist on the commission is also a Tory party donor.
And that fundraising dinner I found was attended by Jules Osborne. So exactly, you know, it's quite a high-profile Conservative. But I mean, I think Lord Woolley was saying that they've got to investigate every public body or political institution or political party that's been accused of racism. And both Lord Woolley and Muriel Hussain, who was at the time the only Muslim commissioner, says that they've completely, and this was her view, that they've completely neglected the issue of Islamophobia. And, you know, when you've got, if from my own personal experience, when I ask British Muslims, do you know what the EHRC is? The overwhelming majority who have suffered from Islamophobia. And we have to remember, most Muslims do not report the hate crimes that they suffer. And, you know, there was a report in the Northeast that was published about Muslims in the Northeast, something like above 80% of this reported, who were surveyed, reported experiencing Islamophobia. That most British Muslims on the grassroots who experience that Islamophobia, kind of, the EHRC exists in a completely different world for them, which is from what they've told me. I mean, I'm a journalist and I kind of know about it. So, I mean, from what the EHRC have told me repeatedly on the 3 stories I've published, including the one that involved 100 mosques. I mean, that's not, you know, I leave it to other journalists why they've chosen not to cover that story. 100 mosques up and down the country, from Scotland all the way to London, Luton, where I live, as well as Muslim organisations, very prominent Muslim organisations, asking the EHRC or to investigate and accusing them of a complete negligence. This was their words, that they accused them of a complete negligence towards British Muslims. And I put those to the HRC, and they said that at this stage they haven't decided to investigate the Conservative Party because they're waiting for the Conservative Party to finish its own independent investigation into Islamophobia. But I think I'll leave that to others to draw the conclusion.
Basit, Mahmood, great reports. I really recommend that all our viewers go and read those. Are all free in Newsweek?
Yeah, I think the first 5 are free. Your first 5 articles.
Yeah. So you can read all 3 of them as long as you only read 2 other articles from Newsweek.
Well,
Basit, Mahmood,
great quality content. That's
yeah. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Cheers. Thank you.
We're going to move on to our final story in one moment. First of all, though, I do just want to go through what I think is quite an important point here, because I think the findings of Basit there are very important. If you've got an organisation, a body, which was given the responsibility to enforce racial equality legislation in the country, and it has only one commissioner who's non-white, and they also happen to be someone who has donated or been involved in a fundraiser for the Conservative Party, I think that does raise serious questions. And this hasn't been reported in any of the mainstream British press in the last 3 years. A long time. So it's notable. This was written in Newsweek, an American magazine. I haven't seen this anywhere else. And I actually searched on The Guardian to see, have they covered this recently? And it was quite interesting, I suppose, what I found, because in 2016 and 2017, The Guardian were reporting about criticisms of the EHRC. So I'm going to go through a few of them. So in May 2016, they reported on concerns that the board's newly appointed chair planned to remain a partner at a law firm which did work for the government and other organisations under the EHRC remit. So the idea that the commissioners were not necessarily independent of government in terms of their other interests. So next, let's go to March 2017. Oh, that was the Press Association. March 2017, the EHRC was criticised when 12 staff selected for compulsory redundancies, 8 were from a BAME background and 6 were disabled. So you see 2/3 of the people who've been been sacked, I suppose, essentially, were from BAME backgrounds. Again, fairly worrying if you're the equalities body. December 2017, the paper reported on complaints from lawyers that government ministers were vetoing potential appointments to the commission on political grounds. That's an incredibly serious accusation. The idea that, as I say, this body of 10 commissioners who are supposed to hold the government accountable for these kind of things, if you've got ministers who are vetoing people for political reasons, then that clearly is a system that is not working. However, these are all in The Guardian, as one of them was written up by the Press Association, but all published in The Guardian. However, since that piece in December 2017, there has only been one article mentioning criticisms of the body of the EHRC. That was in June this year, and the criticisms were from, yes, Jeremy Corbyn. Okay, so in that piece, it's a report on an interview that Jeremy Corbyn did with the Middle East Eye. He says that he thinks potentially, they're too close to the government. There are all of these articles that The Guardian have written in 2016 and 2017, which suggest precisely that, but none of those original complaints are pointed out in this article. So the framing of that article is very much, Corbyn's criticizing this body purely because they're investigating him. Now, obviously, that's not completely implausible, but the fact that there are these serious criticisms of this body, which have not been reported at a time when the EHRC is talked about all the time, and used to be talked about, but now it's in the context of they're investigating the Labour Party or they're investigating Corbyn's Labour. No one wants to talk about the fact that this could be a body which isn't completely perfect. No one mentions that. To mention that is itself conspiratorial. And I think it's a real dereliction of duty that our press is not bothering to report on these quite shocking and important findings and facts that Basit Mahmood has been publishing in Newsweek. We're going to go on to our final story. Before we do that, if you are enjoying the show, if you enjoy all of our shows or most of our shows, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. We've been getting a bunch of super chats as well today. We always appreciate those. Keep those coming. Like the video, share the video, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell button. Let me go to our final story. I just have to scroll a little bit because we changed the order, didn't we? Here we go. Since a government announcement late on Saturday night, Brits returning from Spain have been required to self-quarantine for 14 days when they arrive in Britain. It comes as Spain is experiencing a second wave in COVID infections. Let's take a look at Boris Johnson explaining the quarantine policy.
What we have to do is take swift and decisive action where we think that the risks are starting to bubble up again. And let's be absolutely clear about what's happening in Europe, amongst some of our European friends. I'm afraid you are starting to see in some places the signs of a second wave of the pandemic. It's vital that when people are coming back from abroad, if they're coming back from a place where I'm afraid there is another outbreak, they must go into quarantine. And that's why we've taken the action that we have, and we will continue throughout the summer to take such action where it is necessary.
So, I mean, what he was saying, he's not normally reasonable when he talks, but I mean, there was reason, I think, for the government imposing this quarantine on people coming from Spain. We can have a look at the dramatic rise in cases there over the past couple of weeks. So you can see that over the past, or in less than a month, cases have quadrupled. There were 6,361 new cases reported over the weekend. So clearly, I mean, it looks like the R number is very much above 1. You're looking at what looks like exponential growth. So the idea that if you're coming from a region with a very high R rate, you should quarantine on the way back seems fair enough. But this is not to say, there's talk of a second peak in Europe. It is much less, well, serious is an odd word to use, but it's at a much lower level than it was at the peak of the crisis. So it doesn't necessarily look like we're about to see the kind of catastrophe which we saw in February and March. I think we can get up another graphic from the BBC, which I thought was quite, good to ground ourselves in the reality of this instead of have a panic. You can see that the 7-day rolling averages in even Spain, where this peak is going on, were above 150 per million and now remain still below 50 per million, and that's with massively increased testing. So we're not seeing the kind of surges we saw back in February and March, but still worrying. What I think is most relevant, though, because obviously it's not really we're not here to say how risky is it. We're here to talk about the politics of this. And I do think that what's going on in Europe right now, in Britain, across the developed capitalist world, is bizarre. Because we are sort of enabling, yes, it doesn't look like a peak to the extent that what we had, in February and March, but we're enabling coronavirus cases to grow when we know that it might even have long-lasting effects. Also, when we're talking about opening schools, there are priorities that we should be making to say, we want to open this, and to open this, we've got to close this, but we're still opening, nightclubs, gyms, everything. I want to read a section from an FT article on this second wave today, which I thought sort of represented what's odd about not just our government policy, but government policy in general when it comes to coronavirus, I suppose in the market-based economies, because it's all about protecting profit, it seems. Let's get this up. Spain is one of the worst affected countries. It recorded nearly 14,000 new cases in the week to July 26th, with regional hotspots in Aragon, Catalonia, and Novara. France, which reported 6,325 cases in the past week, is another country where the public is becoming less cautious. What is striking is that in the past few weeks, the French have lost the notion of social distancing and caution. Jean-François Delfraissy, the French government's top advisor, said last week. Appealing to people's sense of civic duty, he said, our actions will determine whether we have an epidemic that is manageable or if there are too many clusters to escape control. Tourists are a particular worry. Officials are concerned they are picking up the virus in crowded bars and nightclubs at resorts in countries such as Spain and spreading it among family and friends at home. Now, what I find is just completely bizarre about this is, on the one hand, you say, these young people, they're not socially distancing properly. They're relaxing. They've forgotten that we've got this dangerous pandemic about, and so they're letting their guard down. And ultimately, they're letting the side down. But then in the next paragraph, they're worried that people are catching this. They're not social distancing in nightclubs. Of course they're not social. You can't social distance in a nightclub. And all of this, rush to get back to business as usual, it's risking these peaks. It means it's less likely that kids are going to be able to go back to school in September, because if we're in the middle of an outbreak, then we can't afford to, take other risks which increase the R rate. And it's just so, businesses which the government can't be bothered to support properly can open for a couple of months before they have to all close down again in the middle of the next wave. It just seems bizarre to me. Dalia, have you ever socially distanced in a nightclub?
I'm too old and rickety to be going to nightclubs anymore. I'm in bed at 10 o'clock. I'm
coronavirus ruined you?
Coronavirus, like, self-isolation is what I was doing before anyway. I like to stay in my house. But anyway, I think that again, we are seeing market-based economies, as you say, being thrown into this complete conundrum and this complete contradiction, whereby, you know, people are being told to act as if everything's normal, you know, go back to normal, but stay alert, but, you know, social distance, but do this. And, like, you know, go to work, but don't take public transport. And no kind of and even for some of the measures that have been implemented, for example, you know, saying that workplaces need to try and implement some kind of social distancing, there's no process of accountability for that. I know, you know, myself and many of my friends have all experienced, you know, bosses trying to make them violate coronavirus safety things, safety protocol. And it's like, when that happens, when your boss is telling you to do something, who is the body that I go to report that I'm being made to do this? And not to mention the fact that for a lot of gig workers, they're still having to go to work because they're not included in the furlough scheme, which is going to end soon anyway. And therefore, people will go to work even if they have symptoms. But I think that this move with Spain, of course, you know, a case can be made because Spain is spiking that, you know, there should be a quarantine period when if someone is traveling from Spain. But I think that what is happening here is when the state is seen to be or is perceived to be weak in a variety of ways, there are two arenas that it sort of goes back to in order to assert and perform its strength, and that's sex and borders. So they'll do something, they'll, you know, take a nice shit on the trans community, or they'll, you know, talk about ramping up borders because that's where the state can show its might. And I basically think that that's what's happening here, in that we're not seeing the actual decisive and bold action that would be needed. For example, by saying to employers that, you know, if your workers can work from home, they need to be continuing working from home, that workers should not be having to go to crowded bars and things like this. But instead of taking that bold action, they're remaining really feeble on the stuff that might challenge capital, but kind of being seemingly arbitrarily strong when it comes to, you know, saying that Europe is, you know, seeing a second spike of the virus and we're doing completely fine. So we just need to put down like policy to make it clear that Europe's doing really, really badly and we're doing really, really great. So I think it's a little bit of a smokescreen, because the actual measures that we need to prevent a second spike, which we know is coming, which is social distancing, not going on public transport, going to work if you don't have to, and masks and testing, is not happening.
You're going a bit pixelated. Now I'm back in the studio. I used to go pixelated. I never go pixelated anymore. Now I come back in the studio. Great. And I don't have to use public transport. You can see my bike in the background. To conclude, don't tell us to socially distance, but then also tell us to get the tube back to work, because the two things aren't consistent. And don't tell us to socially distance, but also say go on holiday and go to nightclubs because they need your business. Be consistent. It's one or the other. You can't tell people to go back to normal to save the economy, and then when they start going back to normal, say, oh, they've messed it up because they've let their guard down. It's one or the other. Choose. I hope they choose the safety one instead of the kind of nuts, let's all go back to normal and fuck the consequences. I'm not into that one personally, but maybe I'm being small c conservative. In any case, Dalia, Gebrial, it's been a pleasure as always to be joined by you on a Wednesday night. And thank you to all our viewers for watching and for your super chats tonight. If you want to support us directly, then do go to novaramedia.com/support. We'll be back on Friday at 8 p.m. So do hit subscribe. Sometimes our videos are not coming up in people's feeds as often as we'd like. Mondays took quite a while to appear. So do hit that bell button. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.